This is sound localization, part 2. So we've talked about the cues that we use for localizing where sounds are coming from. And now I'm going to go into some of the physiology of where the brain and potentially how the brain is calculating or using those cues in order to figure out where sounds are coming from. And I'm going to talk for a little while here about interaural time differences, which I know a bit more about than interaural level differences. We apparently have, so what originally was proposed back in 1948 was this Jeffress model that suggested that we have narrowly tuned neurons. These are neurons in the superior olivary nuclei and in the inferior colliculus that respond to a narrow range of interaural time differences. And he talked about these as coincidence detectors, as his model was a kind of coincidence detector model. And you can see from the picture that this is really assuming specificity coding. I'm going to end up saying that more recently it looks like this is what is happening in birds, and I'm not sure if that's what the animals that we were looking at back then or why this was assumed back in 1948, but this does happen in certain species, and it's possible still that it happens in us, but it's not as clear. So if we look at a sound that's coming from in front of us, which is being shown in the top picture over to the far right, that's going to hit the left and the right ears at the same time, and then it's going to travel past these neurons that with only the one ear responding, those neurons that are receiving the signal, they don't respond. And it's not until those neurons are both responding, the right ear neuron and the left ear neuron are both responding, that we see the postsynaptic neuron has its response. So it's narrowly tuned in that that center neuron, in this case 5, is going to respond to something that's right in front of us. But if we move something off over to the right, so it's being shown in the picture over to the far right on the bottom, that is going to hit the right ear slightly earlier than the left ear. And again, it's going to be traveling along, and if I'm the receiving neuron and I'm only getting information from one of those two neurons, from the right ear or the left ear, I'm not going to respond. So now it's not until we get over to neuron 3, in this case, that says, that then responds and tells us that that sound is coming off from over somewhere to the right. Later, we discovered broadly tuned neurons, so neurons in the superior olivary nuclei, so in the superior olive, in mammals that are broadly tuned. And you can see with the picture at the top there, so this is a gerbil, which I gave you a little picture of there because they're cute. This is research done on a gerbil, that the neuron is responding to a pretty wide range of interaural time differences. It has its specific time difference that it responds best to, but with this wider range of responses, we're probably looking at a more distributed coding, right, or population coding. I can never remember which one is used in the new book, but those mean the same thing, that we are going to use several neurons or many neurons and look at the pattern of activation. And he compares this, just so you have it in there, to the owl. And he has another picture, which I don't have in my slides, of the owl's neurons that are responding to interaural time differences, and they respond to a much more specifically tuned kind of to a particular time, and you can see the tuning curve on that. So these broadly tuned neurons that they discovered in the gerbil, you can see in the pictures here that I have right hemisphere neurons that are going to respond better or at a higher level of number of impulses when the left ear, when we get something from our left ear first. It's kind of in the middle when something's coming at us from straight on, so at 0. And there's actually maybe a tiny bit, I think that's showing a little bit of inhibition. There aren't numbers on there, but a little bit of inhibition potentially for the right ear first. Really very little activation at all. For the left, the neurons that are in the left hemisphere, they respond quite well when it's the right ear first, again, kind of in the middle, when there's something that's hitting both ears at the same time, and really not responding barely at all, maybe even a little bit of inhibition there if it is the left ear first. And now, so if we look at the bottom figure, what this really shows is that pattern of activation very strongly can tell us whether or not something's coming from the center or from the left or from the right. There's nothing in your book about interaural level differences, and I know much less about them, but this is what I know. So it appears that we have neurons in the lateral superior olive that are the first site of extraction of those interaural level differences, and they are sensitive to about a 1 decibel difference, so very tiny difference. And we have, this is comparable, we have comparable thresholds in humans as we have in cats. And so this is actually a slide I stole from Robin Morris, and I find it interesting, but it's not anywhere, and it's just a little tidbits of information. So usually what I do with my face-to-face classes right now is I play part of this Fragile album, which I have on CD, in the classroom, which is I play the very end of We Have Heaven and the very beginning of South Side of the Sky. Now I've gone in and I've found a YouTube video, and this works in the classrooms. This does not work so well, as it depends on where you're sitting, and it depends on the acoustics of the classroom, and it depends on where the speakers are and everything. But if you put your headphones on and you go to this website, this works beautifully. I just listened to it. And you go in about maybe, I think it was a minute, 10 seconds in, and listen for probably about a minute or so, that very end of We Have Heaven to the beginning of South Side of the Sky. You might want to pause this and go do that right now so that you can think about the questions. And I just have all the information up there. This is on the album Fragile, and John Anderson is the vocalist there. The other person I know very well from Yes is Rick Wakeman, but there's the band. And so if you listen to that, and I hope you paused this and listened to that, you want to ask yourself what sound localization cues are being used by the artists. And I did leave a moment of silence there as, again, if you didn't go stop this and listen and think about it. Usually I have some guesses from the class, and I eventually come to what I think what you can possibly do with all of that is just manipulate the interaural level differences as far as what a studio would provide somebody and how those sounds are coming into your ears. I think time differences would be difficult to manage, but that what they would be doing is manipulating the interaural level differences. There's lots of great music that does this. If you have some, you might go listen to that and say, it's really clever the way they used those sound localization cues to kind of put so in this case, it sounds like the person's running from one side to the other side, and then a door slams over on, I just listened to it, over I think on my left side, and then over on my right side again, there's this thunder sound, and we get into the whole, and it continues if you continue listening, going back and forth a bit between ears where you are trying to process exactly where the sounds are coming from, especially if you were growing up like I did in a place where you would have a room and the large speakers would be on either side of the room, and that was kind of the big thing that was happening in the 70s because we had just gone from mono systems to stereo systems in the 60s, and so they were just, those stereo systems were just starting to come into the homes when I was a child. Just like now, I think it's actually not that new anymore, but what is kind of new is the surround sound of the movies and how well they use that to suggest that maybe there's somebody behind you right now. And again, they're using these sound localization cues. And I think it's what they can basically use is interaural level differences. I have a couple more topics in sound localization that I think are interesting, and so I always talk about them. One is the sounds inside and out, so that we can talk about architectural acoustics. And if you can see in A, sounds outside, if I'm listening to the singer and I'm just sitting there on a hill, presuming nobody's around and there aren't any trees, that what's happening, what's coming from that singer playing the guitar is direct sound. Everything else, sound is coming out and going in all directions, right? Maybe not as loud back in B behind the singer with the guitar, but certainly up towards C and D and A, that there's all this sound coming out. But what's hitting my ears is pretty much solely direct sound. And even if there are trees, it's mostly direct sound. Whereas when we go inside, as we see in B, and I'm listening to the singer playing the guitar, I get that direct sound that's coming from A. But now what's coming from B is going back and hitting the back wall and hitting my ears. What's going to C is hitting part of the ceiling, and D is hitting another different part of the ceiling. And so we also have all this indirect sound when we are inside. As I move forward and talk about architectural acoustics, again, something that's kind of interesting to me, and usually as I get students talking and thinking about it, becomes a little bit more interesting to some students, as I'm going to do another one of these kind of questions and making you think about things. But when we're inside, sounds are bouncing off walls. And we have this precedence effect, which we just kind of saw in a picture, but this was studied officially by Litovsky et al. In 1997, where if what we do is we have, I'm going to start with A, the picture up at the top, where they start with the information or the sound is coming out of the left speaker, and then there's a delay of even tenths of a second where the sound starts coming out of the speaker on the right. We hear this just lag, okay? It sounds echoey and we can't tell. It's just this weird lag and it sounds bad. Whereas if the sound starts out on the left and from the left speaker as our lead speaker, and we have that delay being between 5 and 20 milliseconds, so remember that's thousandths of a second. So very quickly we have a delay coming from the right speaker. We get what's called the precedence effect, which means now it sounds like all of the sound is coming from the left speaker. And it's a little bit richer, but it's really coming, in our perception, from the left speaker. And that's the precedence effect. And this brings us to the discussion of architectural acoustics. So when we're inside, we have all this indirect sound that's being sometimes absorbed by the walls, the ceiling, the floor. There's some sound that's being reflected by the walls, the ceiling, the floor. It really depends on what makes up those parts of our rooms. And also the size and the shape of the room influence how sound hits those surfaces and then the direction of those reflections. So what kind of reflected sound or indirect sound that we are going to receive. When I first started teaching this class in 2012, there was a space open in West Columbia called Conundrum, which was a great place to go see these kind of off-brand bands. And I remember seeing some, I don't know what to call them. They don't really fit into a category, but really independent bands that are doing their own things, and they could flip the components of they had little sections of wall that they could flip that would either absorb or reflect. And I was always really disappointed when the place closed down, and I continually asked the guy who owned the place to come talk to my classes, but he said, well, a music professor helped me, and you probably want the music professor to come talk to your classes because they're, college students and blah, blah, blah. But I told him, some college students want to know that this is applicable in a different kind of situation so that you didn't necessarily get your PhD in the acoustics of sound, but you're still open to this really neat concert space. Anyway, originally they thought reverberation time was what was really important in creating our places for concert halls. So the reverberation time is the time it takes sound to decrease to 1/1000th of its original pressure. If it's too long, we get that sound that's like in cathedrals where there are kind of these echoes and we can't tell where sound is coming from. And if that reverberation time is too short, then it's difficult to produce high intensity sounds and to hear them appropriately. Most musicians say that the sound sounds, quote, dead. So we get architectural engineers to help us to create our concert halls. And again, through time, as research early on was suggesting that this reverberation time being 2 seconds was what was really important, it's become clear that it's much more complicated than that. And this field has become much more sophisticated in many ways. And your author uses the example of the New York's Philharmonic Hall, which we know should be a really respected place to play music. And it is a really respected place to play music. But so I almost always have to go in and look at what the book says about all this, because it has this whole history of, in 1962, they created it such that it had a reverberation time of 2 seconds. But they destroyed that, and in 1992, because people would play in there and say that the sound was something was off when they were the musicians, and the listeners too, and the critics. And so in 1992, they built what's it called, the Avery Hall or something like that, and they took into account more than just reverberation time, but they are destroying that and creating a new one. And actually, this was supposed to be created in 2019, according to the book. So the David Geffen Hall, they're going to rebuild it again because it's not quite what they want. The sound is not appropriate. Some of the things we have learned that we need to take into account are intimacy time. So the time between when we hear that direct sound and when that first reflection hits our ears. And the best time is around 20 milliseconds. If you look at this intimacy time, that might remind you of the precedence effect, that for us to hear the original sound and then the first reflection, that 20 milliseconds is the outermost kind of when the precedence effect works, where it sounds like the where it sounds like the sound is coming from where we heard the direct sound coming from. If you go back to that slide and look at the precedence effect. There's also the base ratio, so the ratio of low frequencies to middle frequencies that are reflected from the walls and the surfaces. And we have learned that high base ratios are best, so having a higher ratio of low frequencies, although I'm sure there's a limit to that. And there's also the spaciousness factor, so the fraction of sound that is received that is indirect. And high spaciousness factors are best, giving this experience that you're in a larger space. Okay, so these are things we've learned about architectural acoustics, and this is usually where I ask my class to think about other places where we might consider acoustics and where architectural engineers could help us to create more pleasant places to exist in. And I'm leaving this little moment of silence for you to actually think about that question, because students answer this in many different ways. Often I hear, so I'm going to give you some of the most common answers, and then the funniest answers that I've gotten. Many students say, well, lecture halls, obviously that's on everybody's mind because I'm usually lecturing. And if you're hearing the people next to you or the people coming in and out or the other things that are going on more than you're hearing the professor talking, then that's problematic. I also often hear at church that you really want to hear the preacher and the choir, and that sound, you want that sound to be good. And again, if people are moving around or wrestling or whatever, you don't want to really hear that so much. I usually get the answer libraries, where you want some amount of insulation from sound as much as possible. Every once in a while I've heard people say restaurants, which for my family, because none of us really have a very good ability to attend to a specific sound when there are lots of background noises. That's apparently something that's inherited, because I remember my grandfather being that way. We're all that way. And if we're in a restaurant where the acoustics are such that there's lots of echoes from other people, we can really barely speak to each other because we can't really hear each other that well above and pay attention to each other above all that outside sound. I think those are the main ones, but the funniest one I've ever gotten is a student said bathrooms. Like, I really want public bathrooms to have a better, I don't want to hear I don't want to hear things coming from other stalls, and I don't want other people to hear me. So there you go. If you are at all interested in any of this, the last couple pages here, page 300, where he's talking about this, it's really interesting. So Disney has the Walt Disney Hall, where they have created the seats themselves to absorb the same amount of sound as if someone was sitting in the seats, so that when the performers are practicing, it's going to sound the way it's going to sound when the seats are filled, which is another thing that happens if you're the performer and you're performing in an empty hall. Everything's different because there's nobody in the seats, and our bodies are absorbing sound. There's also this example of Leighton Hall, the Leighton Concert Hall, which I'm giving a picture of here, which is at the De Bartolo Performing Arts Center at the University of Notre Dame, opened in 2004. And so some of these panels, you can position them differently so that the sound is reflected differently. And my understanding, if I remember correctly, they also flip. This is usually when I talk about Conundrum Music Hall, because you can flip those panels to either absorb the sound or reflect the sound, as well as positioning them to as if you are changing really the size and the shape of the room depending on the kind of music that is being played in there. And that was what maybe I didn't say very clearly with the Conundrum Music Hall, that it was not just that it was off-brand music, but that the people who were performing could go in there and practice and create the kind of acoustics for their particular sound. And different music uses different amounts of bass or piano or whatever they're using, electronics. Okay, so that's my finishing up of architectural acoustics. Obviously, it's something I find really fascinating, and I hope you do too. I hope you think about it as a potential, just something to think about as your mind is going off, and especially when you add to it these kinds of things like the Yes Fragile album. So those people back in the 70s, they're still doing it though, right? Where I know you know some songs where they are making the sounds coming from the right, from the left, and maybe changing over time. Maybe they don't do it as much as I think they do, but that is often lost in live concerts, but that they are usually trying to communicate some piece of that. And the architectural acoustics is important.